There are certain steps to follow when writing genotypes on pedigrees. First, you need to know what is dominant and what is recessive. Then, you'll write in all the recessive genotypes first. And that's because for recessive, an individual has to have 2 little letters. Once you have all the recessive individuals assigned, then you'll go back and write in all the dominant genotypes. Remember, there's 2 dominant genotypes. There's homozygous dominant, which is 2 capital letters, and then there's heterozygous, which is a capital and a lowercase letter. So you need to determine which of those genotypes applies to each individual. Now, if you cannot determine if an individual is homozygous dominant or heterozygous, then you need to write both genotypes. Now, here's some example problems. For this pedigree, dimples are shaded black, and dimples are dominant because it's telling us to use a capital D. No dimples are the unshaded ones, and that is the recessive trait. So we now know what's dominant, what's recessive. So next we're going to do all the recessive genotypes first. And those are the unshaded symbols. So they would have to be little d, little d. Now, the next step is for us to do all of the dominant individuals. And when we do this, there's no place that we have to start. We just start wherever it makes sense for us. So when I look at this pedigree and I see that there were 2 recessive children, but their parents were dominant, the only way that can happen is if the parents are heterozygous, because that way they can both be dominant, but they can still pass on a recessive allele to the kids. Those last 2 children, we would have to put both of the dominant genotypes. Those kids could be big D or big D little d, because they could inherit a big D from each parent, or they could inherit a big D from one parent and a little d from the other. Another example problem. Now for this one, we're using a different trait. 6 fingers are shaded red. And so we're gonna use the G's for this trait. And since 6 fingers has a capital G, that is the dominant trait. 5 fingers are the ones that are unshaded, and those are recessive. So now we know what's dominant and what's recessive. So we first fill in the recessive genotypes, and those are the 4 that are unshaded. So they are little g, little g. So now we go and do the rest of the individuals who are all dominant. And again, we just start wherever it makes sense. So those individuals have to be heterozygous. Since this child here is recessive, both parents have to be heterozygous. This person, since she has had a recessive child, we know that she has to give a little g to that child because we get a letter from each parent. So those 2 little g's can't come from the father, one comes from each parent. The 4 that are remaining, we have to put both dominant genotypes, big G, and big G, little g, because we don't have enough information to fully determine what those individuals' genotypes are.